The moment I understood what my husband had done, I was standing in my grandmother's kitchen, holding a glass of sweet tea that never made it to my mouth. "The lake house," my mother-in-law said, smiling over her wine glass like she was announcing a menu change at a restaurant, "is already under contract. Daniel signed everything last month. Isn't that wonderful? No more property taxes hanging over you two." I set the glass down very carefully because my hands had started to shake and I did not want her to see that. "Signed what?" I said. Not a question, a demand dressed up as one. Daniel wouldn't look at me. My husband of 6 years, the man who had held my hand at my grandmother's funeral and promised me in this exact kitchen that the house would always be mine to decide about. He stared at the lemon cake on the counter like it had just insulted his family. "Elena," he said quietly, "we need to talk. Not here." But it was too late for not here. Patricia had already said it out loud in front of her sister, in front of the caterer refilling the deviled eggs, in front of God and everyone at what was supposed to be a simple Sunday visit to celebrate my grandmother's birthday, 6 months after she died, the day we always still marked, the day the house was supposed to be full of her memory instead of an accountant's paperwork. "Signed the sale," Patricia said again, because apparently she thought I hadn't heard her the first time, or because she wanted to watch my face when I did. "Your grandmother's little lake place. Daniel found a buyer. A very generous offer from what I understand." I looked at my husband. I looked at the man I had married in a barn in the Blue Ridge Mountains with fairy lights strung through the rafters, the man who used to bring me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, the man whose mother had never, once in 6 years, called me by my first name without a faint curl of distaste in her mouth, like my name was something she'd stepped in. "How," I said, "did you sign anything? That house is in my name. It was left to me, only me." Daniel finally looked up, and in his eyes I saw something I would spend the next 4 months trying to name. Not guilt, exactly. Guilt would have looked like an apology. This looked like relief, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally, foolishly, believing the worst was behind him, set it down. "You gave me power of attorney after the surgery, remember? You said it was just in case anything happened while you were under." I remembered. Of course I remembered. 8 months earlier, I'd had a minor procedure on my shoulder, nothing serious, but the hospital wanted paperwork in place in case of complications, and Daniel had sat beside me with a legal pad and said, "Let's just get this handled so you don't have to think about it." And I had signed a stack of documents I trusted him with, because he was my husband and I loved him, and I had never, not once, imagined that trust could be turned into a key. "That was for the surgery," I said. My voice had gone very flat, very quiet, the way it does right before something in me breaks. "That was never supposed to touch the house." "The document didn't specify," Daniel said. "It gave me authority over your affairs, financial and property. The lawyer said it was standard language." "What lawyer?" Silence. Marcus examined his wine like it had suddenly become fascinating. "What lawyer, Daniel?" "Marcus Feld, Mom's attorney. He helped me understand the paperwork." And there it was. Not just a betrayal, an arranged one. Planned, reviewed by counsel. My husband had taken a document meant to get me safely through an outpatient procedure and used it, with his mother's lawyer's blessing, to sell the one thing on this earth that still belonged to my grandmother's memory. I want to tell you that I screamed, that I threw the sweet tea in his face, that I said something devastating and walked out and slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. That's what you'd want if you were watching this happen to someone else. That's what would feel satisfying. But that is not what kind of person I am, and it is not what my grandmother raised me to be. I picked my purse up off the counter. I said, "Excuse me," to Patricia's sister, who had the good sense to look mortified, and I walked out to my car, and I sat in the driveway of the house I grew up in, the house that apparently no longer belonged to me, and I did not cry. I made a phone call instead. Because 6 years earlier, on the day I married Daniel Marsh, my grandmother had pulled me aside in the church vestibule and adjusted the collar of my dress and said something I hadn't thought about in a long time. "Elena, honey, I love you more than my own life, and I trust you'll marry well, but just in case you don't, just in case, I want you to remember something. There's more to what I'm leaving you than the house and the money. There's a piece I never told anyone about. Not your mother, not you, not a single soul but my lawyer and me. If anyone ever tries to take what's yours, you call him. His name is Arthur Coyle. He's expecting you whenever the day comes." I had laughed it off at the time. I thought she was being dramatic, the way grandmothers sometimes are about weddings, half joking, half serious, testing the waters of a new son-in-law she wasn't sure she liked yet. Sitting in that driveway, 6 years later, with my marriage cracking open in front of me like the shell of an egg, I finally understood. She hadn't been joking at all.
To understand how I got to that driveway, you need to understand who my grandmother was and who I was before Daniel Marsh ever walked into my life. My name is Elena Whitfield. Whitfield before I married, and Whitfield again now, though I'm getting ahead of myself. I grew up in a modest brick house on Sycamore Lane in a small town outside Charleston, South Carolina, raised almost entirely by my grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. I don't remember much about that year. I remember my grandmother's hands, though. Strong, weathered, always smelling faintly of cedar and dish soap, always steady, even when the rest of the world wasn't. Eleanor Whitfield was not a wealthy woman by the standards anyone in Patricia Marsh's country club would recognize. She ran a small, rare books and antiques shop on King Street for 31 years, the kind of place that smelled like leather bindings and old paper, where she could tell you the provenance of a first edition just by running her thumb along the spine. She never remarried after my grandfather died young. She raised me alone, on a bookseller's income, in a house that was paid off by the time I was in high school because she refused, on principle, to owe anyone anything she couldn't repay in full. What she did have, what most people never knew she had, was a small piece of waterfront property on Lake Moultrie that had been in her family since before I was born. A modest 2-bedroom cottage with a dock and a view that made grown men go quiet when they saw it for the first time. She'd inherited it from her own mother, and she used to take me there every summer, teaching me to fish off that dock, telling me stories about my great-grandmother, a woman who'd apparently been just as stubborn and just as quietly formidable as she was. "This house isn't about the money, Elena," she told me once, when I was maybe 16, sitting on that dock with our feet in the water. "It's about knowing you always have somewhere that's yours, no matter what happens to you out there in the world, no matter who tries to tell you different." I didn't understand what she meant then. I would understand it fully, painfully, years later. I built my own life carefully, the way she taught me to build everything, slowly, with both hands, checking the foundation before I added the next floor. I went to the College of Charleston on scholarship, studied art conservation, and eventually became a conservator at a small museum downtown, the kind of job that paid modestly but let me spend my days with my hands on things worth protecting. I liked the quiet of it. I liked that nobody in that world cared what my last name was or what car I drove. I met Daniel Marsh at a fundraising gala the museum hosted when I was 28. He was handsome in an easy, golden retriever way. Good teeth, good posture, the kind of charm that made waitresses linger at his table a beat longer than necessary. He worked in commercial real estate, which should have told me something, in hindsight, about how he'd come to view property as an asset to be leveraged, not a place to belong to. He courted me the way people in movies get courted. Flowers that showed up at the museum with no occasion attached, long drives with no destination. He asked good questions and actually listened to the answers, which after a string of men who didn't, felt like discovering oxygen. My grandmother liked him, cautiously, the way she liked everyone at first, reserving her real judgment, as always, for later. It was Patricia who never liked me. Not from the beginning, not for one single day. I remember the first dinner at the Marsh House, an enormous colonial revival place with Mount Pleasant, with a circular driveway and a housekeeper who called Patricia ma'am in a voice that suggested she'd learned the hard way what happened if she didn't. Patricia looked me up and down over her reading glasses when Daniel introduced me and said, "Whitfield, any relation to the bookshop Whitfields?" "That's my grandmother," I said. "How quaint," Patricia said, in a tone that made quaint sound like an accusation. It never got better after that. It got worse, slowly, the way water finds cracks in a foundation, not all at once, but steadily, patiently, until one day you look up and realize the whole structure is compromised. Small hurts at first. Patricia introducing me at parties as Daniel's girlfriend. She works at a little museum downtown, even after we were engaged, even after we were married. Patricia sending Daniel, never me, invitations to family events, as though I were a +1 who might or might not be worth including. Patricia's comments about my grandmother's shop, always delivered with a smile, always technically deniable if I ever pushed back. "I just think it's sweet that you didn't grow up with much. It makes you so appreciative of what Daniel can give you." I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself Daniel loved me, and that was the only vote that counted. And for a long time, I believed that. Daniel defended me in those early years, gently, but he defended me. He'd take my hand under the table when his mother said something cutting. He'd tell me afterwards in the car, "Don't listen to her. She's like that with everyone. She'll come around." She never came around. And somewhere along the way, I couldn't tell you the exact year, the exact conversation, Daniel stopped defending me and started instead agreeing with her, quietly, in small ways I almost didn't notice because they were disguised as practicality. Maybe don't bring up the shop at dinner. It just gives Mom something to comment on. You know how she is, just let it go. I think she's just trying to help in her own way.
By the time my grandmother got sick, pancreatic cancer, diagnosed too late the way it so often is, Daniel's commercial real estate business had also started to struggle. The market had turned. 2 big developments he'd invested in personally, outside his firm, had stalled when a partner backed out and left him holding debt he hadn't told me about. I found out about that later, too. There was a great deal, it turned out, that Daniel hadn't told me about. I spent my grandmother's last 4 months mostly at her bedside, taking leave from the museum, sitting in that hospital room, reading to her from the books she loved, the ones she'd kept for herself out of 31 years of inventory instead of selling. Daniel visited when he could. Patricia visited exactly twice, both times for under 20 minutes, both times managing to mention, unprompted, how generous it was of my grandmother to be leaving me anything at all, given how modest everything was. My grandmother died in March, on a Tuesday morning, with my hand in hers. Her last real conversation with me 2 days before was about the lake house.
"You keep that place, Elena," she said, her voice thin as paper by then, but still carrying that same iron underneath it. "Whatever else happens, you keep that place. It's not just a house." I promised her I would. I meant it with everything in me. I did not yet know what "not just a house" meant. I would find out in the cruelest possible way 6 months later, standing in her kitchen holding a glass of sweet tea I never drank. The estate settled quickly on paper. My grandmother's will was simple and clear. The shop's remaining inventory and the modest business accounts went to a small trust for the local library's rare books program, which was exactly the kind of thing she would want. The house on Sycamore Lane, where I'd grown up, was left to me outright, and the lake cottage on Lake Moultrie, the dock, the view, the place where I'd learned to fish and to be quiet and to belong somewhere, was left to me in a separate deed held in a simple revocable trust with my name as sole beneficiary and trustee. Her attorney at the time of the will's execution was a man named Arthur Coyle, an old family friend who'd handled her legal affairs for over 20 years, working out of a small office above a coffee shop on Broad Street. I met with him exactly once during probate, a brief and businesslike meeting where he walked me through the documents, had me sign where needed, and told me, as almost an afterthought, "Your grandmother was a very thorough woman, Elena, more thorough than most people ever gave her credit for." I didn't think much of the comment at the time. I had a marriage to hold together, a job to return to, a grief so large I could barely see past it some mornings. I did not think in those early months to wonder what thorough might mean beyond the documents already in front of me. Daniel was attentive during that period, or attentive enough that I didn't look too closely. He helped me sort through my grandmother's house. He sat with me at the lake cottage one weekend in April, just the two of us, and told me it was the most peaceful place he'd ever been. And I remember feeling, for the first time in months, something like hope, the sense that grief might eventually make room for something gentler. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until much later, piecing it together from bank statements and emails I had to fight to get access to, was that by April, Daniel owed just over $400,000 to a private lender on those 2 stalled development deals, personally guaranteed, with a balloon payment coming due in the fall. What I didn't know was that Patricia had been meeting with her attorney, Marcus Feld, since February, discussing, in emails I would eventually read with my own eyes, printed and placed in a folder by a woman who would become the most important ally I had, options for addressing Daniel's liquidity situation using Elena's inherited assets. Using Elena's inherited assets, as though I were a line item, as though the lake house where I'd scattered a handful of my grandmother's ashes off the end of the dock at her explicit request was a liquidity solution to be discussed over billable hours. The power of attorney document, the one I'd signed 8 months before my shoulder surgery in good faith, trusting my husband the way you trust the person you promised your whole life to, had been drafted, I would later learn, not by my surgeon's recommended paperwork service, but reviewed and expanded by Marcus Feld himself at Daniel's request, weeks before the surgery even happened. The standard language Daniel mentioned in the kitchen was not standard at all. It was broad, sweeping, deliberately unrestricted, a document built quietly, patiently, to be useful for something much larger than an outpatient shoulder procedure. I want to be honest with you about something. In the months that followed, I turned that fact over in my mind more times than I could count because it was the detail that hurt worst of all. Not the sale itself, not even Patricia's cruelty, which I'd long since learned to expect. It was the timeline. Weeks before my surgery, while my grandmother was still alive, while I still believed, fully and completely, that my husband loved me without conditions. He had been planning this, before she even died.
The sale of the lake cottage closed on a Thursday in late August, according to the documents I would eventually obtain, 3 weeks before that birthday dinner where Patricia let it slip like a piece of gossip too delicious to sit on. Daniel used the power of attorney to sign as my agent, listing the property through a broker who specialized in quiet, off-market sales to avoid the local paper trail that a listed sale would generate, the kind of sale I would later learn from a real estate attorney I hired that developers use specifically when they don't want a property's true value getting out before they've locked in a low purchase price. The buyer was a limited liability company called Palmetto Shoreline Holdings. I want you to remember that name because it will matter later. It will matter more than almost anything else in this story. The sale price, on paper, was $310,000. Daniel used $280,000 of it to pay down his private lender and stop the balloon payment from destroying what remained of his business. The rest disappeared into accounts I wouldn't get access to for months. Accounts that, I would eventually discover, included a $20,000 transfer to Patricia herself. Reimbursement, according to the memo line, for, quote, legal consulting fees already advanced. She had paid her own son's lawyer to help him sell my inheritance, and then had him pay her back out of the proceeds. I sat with that fact for a long time before I could feel anything about it besides a kind of cold, clarifying disbelief. For 4 months after that dinner, I did not confront Daniel the way you might expect. I did not hire a lawyer immediately, though God knows I wanted to. I did something my grandmother would have recognized instantly, because it was exactly what she would have done herself. I gathered information first, quietly, patiently, before I let a single person know how much I already understood. The morning after that dinner, I called Arthur Coyle. Arthur Coyle's office hadn't changed in the 2 years since I'd last been there. Same worn leather chairs, same smell of old coffee and older paper, same framed photograph on his desk of a much younger Arthur standing beside a woman I recognized with a shock as my grandmother, 30 years younger, laughing at something outside the camera's frame. "I knew you would call," Arthur said, before I'd even finished explaining why I called. He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way you'd say something you'd been carrying for a long time, glad finally to set down. "You knew," I said. "You knew this might happen. Your grandmother knew people, Alina, better than most people ever gave her credit for, myself included sometimes. She met Daniel exactly twice before your wedding. She had dinner with his mother exactly once." He paused. "She came to see me the week after that dinner with Patricia. Do you remember, before the wedding?" I remembered a dinner, vaguely, one of the only times my grandmother and Patricia had spent real time together before the wedding, an awkward evening at a restaurant downtown that I'd mostly tried to forget because of how stiff and strange it had felt. "She told me," Arthur said, "that she didn't trust that family. Not Daniel specifically. She thought he loved you, and I believe she was right about that, as far as it goes. But the mother, she said Patricia looked at people like some folks look at a menu, wondering what they cost and whether they were worth it. Why didn't she say something to me? Would you have listened, 3 weeks before your wedding, deeply in love to a woman who told you your fiancé's mother reminded her of a menu?" Arthur's smile was gentle, but it had an edge of something almost like grief in it. "Your grandmother was many things, Elena, but she was never a woman who tried to control other people's choices. She believed in letting people learn their own lessons. She just made sure if the lesson turned out to be a hard one, you wouldn't be left with nothing." He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, an old wooden thing, slightly swollen with humidity the way everything in Charleston eventually is, and pulled out a folder that looked considerably older than the folder I'd expected.
The label on the tab in my grandmother's own handwriting simply read, "For E, if needed." "This," Arthur said, sliding it across the desk, "is the piece your grandmother never told anyone about. Not your mother when she was alive, not you, not me fully until she came in and had him draft it 4 months before your wedding. My hands were not steady when I opened it." Inside the folder was a document my grandmother had titled, in her own careful hand on the cover page, "The Whitfield Contingency Trust." Beneath that, in Arthur's more formal legal language, was something I had never known existed, a secondary, irrevocable trust established the same year as my wedding, funded not with the lake cottage or the Sycamore Lane house, the assets everyone, including me, believed to be the full extent of what I would inherit, but with something else entirely. My grandmother's rare books business, it turned out, had never been quite as modest as everyone believed. 31 years of careful acquisition, careful cataloging, careful patience, the same patience she'd brought to raising me, had built a private collection that Eleanor Whitfield had never displayed on the sales floor of her shop. First editions, rare manuscripts, a small but exceptional set of early American historical documents she'd acquired piece by piece over 3 decades from estate sales and private collectors who never knew what they were sitting on. She had kept this collection separate from the shop's public inventory, insured privately, stored in a climate-controlled vault 2 floors above the store that I'd walked past 100 times as a child without ever once being told what was behind that locked door. The collection had been appraised 4 years before her death at just under $2.6 million. I read that number 3 times before it settled into something I could hold in my mind without it slipping through my fingers. "She never told me," I said. "She never told anyone she had this." "She wanted to see who you'd become before she decided what to do with it," Arthur said. "And then when Daniel came along, she wanted to see who he'd become too. That's why the trust has the structure it has. Read the conditions, Alina. That's the part that matters now." The Whitfield Contingency Trust, as Arthur had drafted it, held the entire collection in trust for my sole benefit, but it was structured with an unusual triggering condition, one I had never heard of before and have rarely heard of since. The trust would remain entirely dormant, untouched, unmentioned, unless a specific condition was met. If any other asset my grandmother left me directly, the house on Sycamore Lane or the lake cottage or any portion of the estate passing to me outright, was transferred, sold, encumbered, or otherwise disposed of without my knowing, voluntary, written consent obtained independently of any person with a financial or familial relationship to the transaction. In plain language, if anyone I trusted ever took something of mine without my real permission, the dormant trust would activate automatically, its full value releasing to me, and, more importantly, its terms required that the collection first be offered, at a steep discount, for purchase back to me personally, meaning I would have first right to reclaim it fully, while the trust's oversight committee, Arthur and a second attorney my grandmother had named as an independent trustee, would be legally obligated to investigate the circumstances of whatever transfer had triggered the clause. "She called it her final surprise," Arthur said quietly. "Her words, not mine. She said, and I remember this exactly because it struck me as such an odd thing to say about your own granddaughter's marriage, 'If everything goes well, Arthur, nobody ever needs to know this exists, and Elena lives her whole life never even knowing what she had. But if it doesn't go well, if somebody ever tries to take advantage of her, thinking she has less than she does, then I want her to have one card left to play, one they'll never see coming, because they'll never even know the deck had it.'" I sat in that worn leather chair for a long time before I could speak again. "She knew," I finally said. "Somehow she knew this might happen." She didn't know, Arthur said gently. Nobody could have known, not exactly, but she'd lived a long life, Elena, and she'd seen what happens to people, good, smart, kind people, when they love someone who turns out to have a family with an appetite bigger than their conscience. She wasn't protecting you from Daniel specifically, she was protecting you from the possibility. That's the difference between a woman who's naive about people and a woman who's simply hopeful while also being prepared. I thought about the lake cottage, about Daniel's signature on documents he had no right to sign, about Patricia's $20,000 reimbursed for legal consulting, about 4 months of quiet, careful information gathering that I now understood, looking back, I had been doing in exactly the way my grandmother would have wanted me to. The triggers already happened, I said slowly. The lake cottage. Daniel sold it without my consent. Yes, which means the trust has already activated, legally, whether you choose to use it or not. It happened the moment that sale closed, back in August. The question now, Elena, isn't whether you have the surprise. You already do. The question is only what you want to do with it. I looked down at the folder in my hands. 30 years of my grandmother's quiet, patient love, hidden behind a locked door I'd walked past my whole childhood without ever knowing what it protected. I need to know everything, I said. Every document, every dollar. I need to understand exactly what my husband did and exactly who helped him do it before I decide what happens next. Arthur smiled for the first time since I'd walked in, and it was the smile of a man watching someone become in real time exactly who he'd always believed she could be. That, he said, is precisely what your grandmother would have wanted to hear you say. The next 3 months were the strangest of my life, a marriage that continued on its surface in almost total normalcy, while underneath I built, quietly and methodically, the case that would eventually end it. I did not tell Daniel what I knew. I did not tell Patricia. I went to work at the museum. I cooked dinner most nights. I let Daniel believe, as far as I could tell, that the storm from that birthday dinner had passed, that I had accepted the sale the way he'd clearly hoped I would, with hurt feelings that would fade, the way hurt feelings in our marriage always seemed to be expected to fade, on Patricia's timeline rather than mine. What Daniel didn't know was that I had hired my own attorney, not Arthur, whose role needed to stay protected and quiet for the trust's sake, but a sharp, no-nonsense real estate and family law attorney named Priya Anand, recommended to me by a colleague at the museum who'd gone through her own difficult divorce 2 years earlier. Priya worked out of a modest office in a converted house near the medical district, and from our very first meeting, she made something clear to me that I needed to hear. You don't have to decide right now whether you want to stay married. That's not what today is about. Today is about making sure that whatever you decide it from a position of strength, not desperation. Right now, you're the only person in this situation who knows what's actually true. That's an enormous advantage. Don't give it up by acting emotionally before you're ready.
Priya helped me file for a formal accounting of the power of attorney's use, a legal mechanism, it turned out, that exists specifically for situations like mine, allowing a principal to demand a full record of every action taken under a POA, with penalties for an agent who refuses or who's acted in bad faith. Daniel received the notice from Priya's office on a Tuesday in October, and I watched him open the envelope at our kitchen table with an expression that told me, more clearly than any confession could have, exactly how much he understood he'd done wrong. "Elena," he said, "what is this?" "It's exactly what it looks like," I said. "I want a full accounting of everything you did with that power of attorney, every account, every transfer, every signature." "You could have just asked me," he said, and there was something almost wounded in his voice, as though I was the one who'd broken something between us. "I did ask you," I said, "in August, in your mother's kitchen. You told me the document didn't specify. I'm asking you again, formally, so there's no more room for that kind of answer." He didn't respond to that. He looked, for a long moment, like a man watching a bridge he'd been quietly, carefully burning for months finally catch fire in a way he could no longer pretend not to see. The accounting, once it came through, reluctantly, incompletely, forcing Priya to send 2 more formal demands before Daniel's own attorney finally produced complete bank records, confirmed everything I'd already begun to suspect, and revealed one thing I hadn't expected at all. Palmetto Shoreline Holdings, the LLC that had purchased the lake cottage for $310,000, was not, as I'd assumed, an anonymous developer looking to build vacation homes along the lake. Its registered agent, according to the state business filings Priya pulled, was a name I recognized instantly because I had seen it 100 times on invitations and place cards over 6 years of Marsh family events. Robert Hensley, Patricia's brother, Daniel's uncle. The lake cottage had not been sold to a stranger at a fair market price to solve a genuine financial emergency, the way Daniel had tried to frame it to me in the months since. It had been sold to a company controlled by his own uncle at a price Priya's real estate contact confirmed was at least 40% below the property's actual market value, given lakefront comparables in that area. A value that I would later learn had spiked substantially after a county zoning change 3 years earlier that Robert Hensley, who sat on a regional planning advisory board, would have known long before it became public. The lake cottage wasn't a liquidity solution, it was a family transaction. Daniel's debt got paid down, Patricia got her reimbursement, and Robert Hensley got waterfront property worth potentially $500,000 or more at a fire sale price from a family member who had no idea any of it was happening until she heard about it secondhand over deviled eggs. I sat with that discovery for 2 full days before I could make myself feel anything besides a strange, hollowed-out calm. And then, on the 3rd day, I got a phone call from Arthur Coyle that changed the shape of everything again. "Elena," Arthur said, and I could hear, even through the phone, that something in his voice was different, sharper, more urgent than the careful, measured tone he'd used in every conversation we'd had since August. "I need you to come to my office, today if you can." I sat across from him 20 minutes later, and he slid a document across the desk that I didn't recognize at all. The independent trustee I mentioned, the second name on the contingency trust. Her name is Diane O'Coffer. She's a probate attorney I've worked with for years, someone your grandmother trusted completely, and part of her role is to monitor, in a general way, any significant transactions involving property that once belonged to Eleanor Whitefield's estate. It's a standard practice for trusts like this, meant to catch exactly the kind of situation you're in. What did she find? She's been tracking Palmetto Shoreline Holdings since your accounting request went through, because the name triggered an alert filing. Elena, that company isn't just sitting on the lake cottage for personal use. 3 weeks ago, they filed preliminary paperwork with the county for a rezoning and subdivision request. They're planning to develop the property, split it into 4 lakefront lots, build spec homes, and sell them individually. Diane's contact at the county estimates the total development value once complete at approximately $1.4 million. I felt something in my chest go very still. I thought about every dinner at the Marsh house, every comment from Patricia about my grandmother's quaint little shop, every small, deniable cruelty delivered with a smile over 6 years. I thought about a family that, perhaps from the very beginning, saw me not as someone to love, but a door that might eventually open onto something valuable. I want to know one more thing. I want to know if my grandmother ever met Robert Hensley. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he opened a second folder, one I hadn't seen before, thinner than the trust documents, containing what looked like old handwritten notes.
"She did," he said. "Once. At your wedding reception. She wrote to me about it, actually, a few weeks later. I kept the letter because I thought, even then, it might matter someday." He found the page and read it aloud, his voice careful, respectful, the way you read someone else's private words when they can no longer read them themselves. "Robert Hensley asked me tonight, very casually, whether I'd ever considered selling the lake property. Said he knew people who'd pay well above market value for something like that. I told him it wasn't for sale. He smiled and said, 'Everything's for sale eventually, Eleanor.' I didn't like the way he said it. I don't think that family sees people the way decent people do. I think they see opportunities." I sat in that chair for a long time after Arthur finished reading, thinking about a woman who had clocked, correctly, in a single conversation at her granddaughter's wedding reception, a threat that would take the rest of us 6 more years to fully understand. "She built the trust because of that conversation," I said. "I believe she built the trust because of a lifetime of paying close attention to people," Arthur said. "That conversation just told her which family she needed to be ready for." I want to pause here and tell you something about the weeks that followed, because I think it's important, and because it's the part of this story I'm proudest of, even more than what came after. I did not go to Daniel in a rage. I did not confront Patricia at another family dinner, screaming, throwing plates, giving them the satisfaction of watching me come apart the way, I suspect, some part of Patricia had always expected I eventually would, the quaint bookshop girl finally showing her true colors under pressure. Instead, with Priya's guidance and Arthur and Diane O'Coffer's counsel, I built a case, methodically, patiently, the way my grandmother had spent 31 years building a collection nobody else knew existed, one careful acquisition at a time. Priya filed a civil suit against Daniel for breach of fiduciary duty as my power of attorney agent, and separately against Palmetto Shoreline Holdings and Robert Hensley personally for the return of the property or its full fair market value on grounds of self-dealing and fraudulent inducement, given the undisclosed zoning knowledge. Diane O'Coffer, in her role as independent trustee, formally notified the county planning department of the potential conflict of interest history behind the zoning approval 3 years earlier, which triggered, I would learn much later, almost as an afterthought, an unrelated but very inconvenient ethics inquiry into Robert Hensley's other board activities. And I filed quietly for divorce. Not out of spite, not even by that point out of anger, though the anger was still there, banked low like coals that hadn't gone out, just gone quiet. I filed because somewhere in those 3 months of careful, patient work, I had come to understand something my grandmother clearly understood long before I did. that a marriage is supposed to be the one place in the world where someone protects what's yours as fiercely as you protect theirs. Daniel had done the opposite. He had used the one document I'd ever trusted him with, signed in a moment of vulnerability, meant to smooth over a minor surgery, to quietly dismantle the last physical piece of the woman who raised me in order to bail out a business failure he'd hidden from me for over a year, at the encouragement of a mother who had never once in 6 years tried to see me as anything other than an asset with an inconvenient last name. I didn't need revenge. Revenge would have meant becoming someone my grandmother wouldn't have recognized. What I needed, what I was owed, was simply the truth, on the record, and the return of what was mine. The lawsuit and the divorce filing landed on the same day in early December, 4 months after that birthday dinner, delivered by process servers to Daniel at his office and to Patricia and Robert Hensley at their respective homes. Priya had timed it deliberately. She wanted all 3 of them served on the same afternoon before any of them had a chance to coordinate a story with each other. I heard secondhand through a cousin of Daniel's who still occasionally texted me, out of what I think was genuine, if slightly guilty, sympathy, that Patricia's reaction upon being served was to call an emergency family meeting that same night, the same dining room, I imagine, where she had first looked at me over her reading glasses and called my grandmother's bookshop quaint. I wasn't there for that meeting, but I didn't need to be. Because 3 weeks later, I was in a very different room, a mediation conference room downtown, with Priya beside me, Diana Coffer present in her role as trustee, and Daniel, Patricia, and Robert Hensley's respective attorneys arranged across the table like pieces on a board that had just been flipped without their permission. The mediation lasted 6 hours, though the part that mattered took less than 20 minutes. Robert Hensley's attorney went first because the exposure on his side was clearest. The self-dealing claim, backed by Diane's documentation of the zoning timeline, combined with the ethics inquiry the county had already opened, meant Robert was facing not just civil liability, but the very real possibility of losing his seat on the planning board and the reputation he'd spent decades building in local business circles. His attorney offered within the first hour to return the Lake Cottage property to me directly, deed reconveyed in full, no further compensation demanded on either side, in exchange for a confidentiality agreement and my commitment to not pursue the fraudulent inducement claim to trial. I looked at Priya. She gave me the smallest nod. The one we'd agreed on beforehand meant, "This is a genuinely good outcome, but the decision is yours."
"I'll take the property back," I said, "but I want the confidentiality agreement limited to the civil terms only. Nothing that prevents Diane's office from continuing to cooperate with the county's separate inquiry into the zoning approval. What Robert Hensley did with his position on that board isn't just my problem to resolve privately. Other people deserve to know if that board's decisions were compromised." Robert Hensley's attorney did not love that condition. Robert Hensley, sitting rigid and gray-faced across the table, loved it even less. But faced with the alternative, a public trial airing exactly how a sitting planning board member had structured a family real estate deal around zoning knowledge only he possessed, his attorney agreed within the hour. Daniel's portion took longer, and it was harder in a way I hadn't fully prepared myself for, because some small, stubborn part of me had spent 6 years loving this man, and watching him sit across a conference table from me with his own attorney beside him, negotiating the terms of what he owed me, was a kind of grief I hadn't budgeted for in all my careful planning. His attorney tried, at first, to argue that the power of attorney document had given him legitimate authority, that this was a reasonable interpretation of broad standard language, rather than a breach. The same argument, dressed in nicer clothes, that Daniel had offered me in his mother's kitchen 4 months earlier.
Priya dismantled that argument in under 5 minutes, walking through the timeline of when the document had been drafted relative to my surgery, the involvement of Marcus Feld weeks before the procedure, and the fact that the sale went to a family member at below market value, using information Daniel could reasonably have known Robert possessed. "Your client," Priya said in the flat, precise tone I'd come to genuinely love watching her use, didn't misinterpret a document. He and his mother had that document expanded months in advance, specifically to create the authority he later used. That's not an interpretation issue. That's premeditation. Daniel's attorney folded on the breach of fiduciary duty claim within the hour, agreeing to a financial settlement, full repayment of the difference between the sale price and the true market value, plus damages, funded in part by liquidating his remaining stake in the real estate firm, which, I later learned, effectively ended his career there once his partners learned the full story. The divorce itself, once the property and financial claims were resolved, moved quickly. Priya secured me a settlement that reflected 6 years of marriage fairly, without needing to touch a single dollar of the Whitfield Contingency Trust, which remained, as my grandmother had always intended, entirely separate from anything Daniel or his family had ever known to look for. At the very end of that 6-hour mediation, as attorneys packed up folders and Robert Hensley's face had gone the particular shade of gray that comes from a man realizing his reputation has just quietly ended, Daniel asked Priya if he could speak with me alone for a moment in the hallway. Priya looked at me, and I nodded, not because I owed him anything, but because I realized I wanted this last piece for myself, a door I needed to close with my own hands rather than have someone close it for me. "I never wanted to hurt you, Elena. The business was failing, Elena. I panicked. My mother said it was the easiest way, that you'd understand eventually, that families help each other." Families don't take things from each other and call it help. My grandmother helped me my entire life. She never once did it by taking something away from me first. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there is one. "For what it's worth," I said, and I meant this honestly, without cruelty, because by then the anger had really gone quiet. "I hope you figure out, eventually, why you let your mother's version of family override your own vows. I hope you become someone who wouldn't do this again. I just can't be the person who waits around to find out if you do." I walked out of that building, alone, into a cold, bright December afternoon, and for the first time in 4 months, I let myself cry. Not from grief, and not from anger, but from something closer to relief. The particular relief of a weight you didn't fully realize you'd been carrying until the moment it's finally, completely set down. The Lake Cottage deed was reconveyed to me in January, exactly as it had been before. My name, sole owner, the trust structure my grandmother had originally set up, now restored in full. I drove out there on a cold, clear Saturday morning, alone, and stood on the dock where I had once scattered a handful of her ashes, and I told her, out loud, because there was no one else around to hear me, and because it felt important to say it where she could, in whatever way these things work, actually hear it. "You were right," I said, "about all of it. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you were protecting me from." The Whitfield Contingency Trust remains largely untouched to this day. I chose, with Arthur and Diane's guidance, to use only a modest portion of it to cover my legal fees and to fund necessary repairs on the lake cottage, which had been neglected during the months Robert Hensley's company controlled it. The rest, the bulk of 31 years of my grandmother's quiet, careful collecting, remains exactly where she intended, a foundation I have not needed to touch. A final surprise, I hope, honestly, to never need again, but which I now understand, in a way I never could have before all this happened, as the truest expression of how she loved me. Not loudly, not by telling me what to do or who to trust, but by preparing, patiently for a day she hoped would never come, so that if it ever did, I would never be as powerless as someone might have assumed a woman like me, modest, kind, unassuming, would be.
I still work at the museum. I sold the house on Sycamore Lane eventually, not because anyone forced my hand, but because I was ready and used part of the proceeds to fully restore the lake cottage, which I now live in year-round, waking up most mornings to the same view that used to make grown men go quiet when they saw it for the first time. I heard, through channels I no longer pay much attention to, that Robert Hensley resigned from the Regional Planning Board shortly after the ethics inquiry concluded, that his standing in local business circles never fully recovered, and that Patricia, in the wake of Daniel's business collapsing and her brother's public humiliation, has grown notably quieter at the country club events she still apparently attends. I take no particular joy in any of that. I take a quieter kind of peace instead, the kind that comes not from watching someone else suffer, but from knowing that the truth, once it was finally allowed into the room, did exactly what the truth is supposed to do. I think about my grandmother often, standing at that dock or moving quietly among the shelves of her shop, appraising things other people walked past without a second glance. I understand now what she meant all those years ago, sitting on that same dock with our feet in the water. This house isn't about the money. It's about knowing you always have somewhere that's yours. She didn't just leave me a house in the end. She left me the understanding that being kind and being careful were never opposites, that patience isn't the same thing as weakness, and that the quietest people in any room are often the ones who've spent the longest time preparing for exactly the storm everyone else refuses to see coming. She had one final surprise waiting all those years for a day she hoped would never arrive. I'm just grateful now that when it did, I finally knew where to look.